Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty specific, but huge in its impact: silver. And how this one mineral didn't just make Spain rich, it physically built cities. We're talking the largest, most complex cities in colonial Spanish America, appearing almost, well, overnight. It's about how finding these huge silver deposits basically kicked off a whole new civilization there.
That really nails it. You know, usually when we study empires, we think politics or armies, decrees, conquests, that sort of thing. But here, it was digging stuff out of the ground. Raw material extraction was the real engine driving the scale of the empire. So yeah, our mission in this deep dive is to really pull out the key insights about these silver cities. We want to get into how silver changed everything, how cities grew, the global economy, and how society was set up, often, brutally set up.
And we're focusing on the big ones, the real powerhouses. You have to try and picture the amount of wealth just pouring out of Potosí, that's said in modern Bolivia. And then these enormous operations in Mexico, Zacatecas, Guanajuato. These weren't just little boom towns that faded away. They instantly became these massive colonial centers, bigger than many European cities at the time, actually.
Okay, so let's unpack this transformation. It's kind of mind-boggling. I mean, imagine trying to build a major city basically from scratch in these remote, often really high-altitude, tough landscapes. Silver was the catalyst, no doubt. But the speed, the scale, it's still stunning centuries later. Just the organizational effort to create the biggest cities in the colonies in, what, a few decades? It's hard to even imagine.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is that these weren't cities growing organically around a river crossing or a fort. They were basically the first truly industrial cities in the Western Hemisphere, almost purpose-built. Everything about them, the layout, the laws, the trade rights, how they were governed, it was all designed around one thing: getting that silver out. It was an extractivist model from day one.
Extractivist. So the whole point, the whole basis of the society was pulling wealth out of the earth. Not like, say, farming or trade driving it.
Exactly. And this machine, this extractivist machine, it needed fuel. The wealth itself acted like this huge magnet. It pulled in just a dizzying mix of people. The cities had to somehow house them, organize them, this incredibly diverse group.
Right. So who actually made up this instant society? It couldn't have just been Spanish guys looking for silver.
Oh, not at all. The population was, well, meticulously structured. You could say stratified by role and by race. At the very top, sure, you had the Spanish settlers, the administrators running things, the bureaucrats, and crucially, the powerful merchants and mine owners, the ones with the capital controlling the output. But the sheer numbers that came from the labor force, and it was vast, huge numbers of indigenous laborers, often forced into it through systems like the mita, and alongside them, enslaved African people doing some of the absolute toughest work above and below ground.
I'm just trying to picture the logistics, moving all that ore, needing water, refining materials, often way up in the mountains. Potosí is incredibly high. What kind of infrastructure did they need just to keep the mines running? Beyond the mine shaft itself, I mean.
Well, the city was the support structure, in a way. The whole thing was geared towards the mine. And these mining centers couldn't feed themselves, obviously. They were built on rock. So they forced the creation of these huge spin-off industries, often miles away. You needed agriculture on a massive scale, sometimes hundreds of miles distant, just to feed everyone. Textiles to clothe them. And transport. Critical, huge transport networks, not just trails, but proper roads built for constant, heavy carts. And these roads had to connect eventually to major ports to get the silver out.
So roads leading not just to the nearest farm, but roads leading ultimately across the ocean.
Right.
Okay, this is where the local story gets global, right? How did this frantic local engine actually prop up Spanish power worldwide?
Exactly. If you zoom out from the local view, the mines, the cities, you see the bigger picture. Silver wasn't just building colonial cities, it was basically funding the entire Spanish imperial project. It was quite literally the financial backbone of Spain's global power.
And this is where it gets wild. These remote mountain towns, Potosí, Zacatecas, suddenly they're plugged into the whole planet. These cities gave the colonies this unique central connection to the global economy that was just starting to bubble up. Silver wasn't just valuable metal, it was currency. Pure currency, and really the only currency Spain could reliably use internationally.
Yeah.
Huge amounts.
Precisely right. The famous piece of 8, the Spanish dollar, minted from silver pouring out of these American mines, it arguably became the first real global currency. And we see from the sources that this silver flowed out of the Americas and was used heavily in trade, especially with Asia. Wow. Just pause and think about that leap. Silver dug out of the Andes or the Mexican highlands ends up greasing the wheels of trade across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. That connection is incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
And they weren't just sending it for fun. The huge economy of Ming China and later Qing China ran on a silver standard. Spain wanted Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, spices. Everyone did, but China wanted silver. So the silver from Potosí shipped out, often via the Manila galleons across the Pacific. That was the payment. Without American silver, Spain simply couldn't have played such a dominant role in that massive global exchange.
So these cities, Potosí, Zacatecas, Guanajuato, they're administrative centers.
Yeah.
They're giant economic engines, obviously, but they're also cultural hubs and, crucially, the nodes connecting the Spanish colonies into this vast, complex global trade network. A network completely centered on this one shiny metal. Decisions made in a freezing mine shaft high in the Andes could affect prices in Canton. Amazing. But yeah, we have to talk about the other side of the coin, the paradox. While all this immense world-changing wealth was being generated, the sources are very clear about the really harsh social realities and the environmental damage created right alongside the fancy churches and plazas.
That brings us to the crucial question, doesn't it? What was the cost of all this global wealth? And the answer is, well, it's staggering. The sources show the immediate creation of these incredibly rigid social hierarchies, very sharply defined. At the top, this powerful new class of mine owners, merchants, swimming in silver wealth, monumental fortunes.
And then at the bottom, the sheer number of people doing the actual work. What do we know about their conditions?
It was a huge laboring population. Indigenous workers, again, often forced through the META system communities, had to send men for periods of forced labor. And enslaved Africans, too. They were subjected to just incredibly harsh conditions. Dangerous work, deep underground, often at punishing altitudes. This group really bore the human cost of this rapid, extractivist wealth machine. The sources really stress this conflict. Unbelievable wealth creation on one hand, pervasive misery for the workers actually extracting it on the other.
And when you have that kind of extraction, that kind of rapid, almost unplanned industrial growth, the environment always pays a price too. What specific environmental costs or even medical costs did this era leave behind?
Oh, the long-term costs are laid out quite explicitly. First, deforestation. Massive deforestation. The refining process needed huge amounts of fuel for furnaces to process the ore. So forests around the mines and refining areas were just stripped bare. That permanently changed the local ecology. Then second, you had severe pollution, slag heaps, runoff from the processing.
And the refining process itself, the chemistry.
Yeah.
That was deadly too, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely deadly. To get the silver out efficiently, they didn't just smelt it. They heavily relied on the amalgamation process. That meant mixing the crushed ore with mercury. The mercury bonds with the silver, separating it out. Highly efficient for production, yes, but it guaranteed widespread chronic mercury poisoning for the workers handling it, breathing the fumes day in and day out, living near the contaminated water.
That's just horrific. A deliberate trade-off, really. Human health sacrificed for speed and profit.
And it had devastating, long-lasting effects. The sources are clear. This poisoning didn't just shorten workers' lives then and there. It contaminated local ecosystems, the water, the soil, affecting public health for generations to come. So the economic transformation silver brought, it was built quite literally on human and ecological wreckage. It was baked into the system.
So what's the big takeaway here for you listening? The core point is that silver's impact was utterly transformative. No question. It built immense wealth, it cemented Spanish colonial power, and it created some of the biggest, richest cities the Americas had ever seen. But, and it's a huge but, this happened at a terrible cost. A clear, calculated cost in human lives, forced labor, and lasting environmental damage. The whole system prioritized extraction above absolutely everything else.
Yeah, and what I find truly fascinating is how this urgent global hunger for one single resource could instantly create such complex structures. Social structures, economic structures, physical cities, all fundamentally designed purely for extraction. And those structures, the roads, the ports, the global connections, and maybe most importantly, that rigid social hierarchy between the wealthy elite and the laborers, they proved incredibly sticky. They lasted, shaping the politics and economics of these regions long after the silver boom itself started to fade.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about how essential these hubs, administrative, economic, cultural looter, forged by silver, fueled by forced labor, how essential they were not just for making Spain rich then, but for actually maintaining and sustaining that colonial power across oceans and continents, even while causing immense damage internally, socially, and ecologically. It's this powerful tension between extraction and endurance, wealth and cost that still resonates, I think. We'll leave that with you. Welcome back to The Deep Dive.
Today, we're exploring something pretty fundamental, I think. This idea that certain resources, they don't just create wealth. They actually act like magnets, pulling people across continents, creating cities almost out of thin air. And in doing so, completely rewriting the social and demographic map, basically overnight. Our sources today are, well, they're dramatic. They focus on silver. We're doing a deep dive comparison of two major colonial centers, Potosí, way up in the Andes, and Zacatecas, and what was New Spain, Mexico. What we really want to understand is the surprising fallout, socially and demographically. How could two cities, both built on silver, end up so different because of their labor systems?
It's a fascinating comparison, really. A kind of natural experiment in extraction economics. I mean, both cities hit incredible levels of prosperity. They sped up urbanization, created these really diverse multi-ethnic populations. But that speed, that growth, it came at a huge human cost. And how that cost was paid depended entirely on how the Spanish decided to get the labor they needed. So by looking at Potosí's forced draft, the Mita versus Zacatecas, which relied more on wages.
Well, you see two very different urban paths emerge from the same silver boom.
Okay, let's start with the giant, Potosí, the mountain of silver. It was founded in 1545, and the boom that followed it's almost hard to grasp. The population just exploded. Sources say it swelled to over 200,000 people at its peak in the 17th century, which, puts it on par with, or even larger than, most major European cities at the time, London, Paris.
Right.
And that kind of scale, that level of mining output, it needed a massive labor force, one that just wasn't there locally. Which brings us straight to the Spanish Mita system. And this wasn't just like finding workers. This was mobilization on a state level.
Okay.
Exactly. The Mata was the absolute bedrock of Potosí's economy. And its social structure, too. Now, the Spanish argued it was based on an older Incan tradition, communal labor rotation. But they basically took that concept and transformed it, turned it into this enormous state-controlled forced draft system, designed purely to funnel indigenous men into the mines and, critically, the refineries. And the numbers involved, they really show the human scale of this. Our sources consistently point to about 13,000 men being conscripted every single year, annually. And these weren't locals. They were pulled from this vast surrounding region, the Mita district, stretching hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. Think about this. That rate meant roughly 1 out of every 7 adult indigenous males in those regions was forced into the mines.
1 in 7, annually. It's just a staggering demographic drain on those communities, far away from Potosí itself. But it wasn't just draining resources from those areas. It was fundamentally shifting where people lived. Because the journey was so long, the work so brutal, and the draft rotational, well, many men didn't go alone. They brought families. Or maybe after their term was up, they just stayed, settled in or near Potosí permanently, perhaps to avoid being drafted again later. So you get this depopulation out in the Mita zones, and at the same time, this huge, volatile city booming high in the Andes.
Right, and that directly shapes the city's makeup. Potosí became incredibly wealthy, yes, but that wealth created instant, very rigid social layers. You had the Spanish elite, the administrators, the mine owners living in considerable luxury, then skilled workers, overseers, but beneath them, this enormous population of indigenous laborers, the Mitayos. And importantly, also a significant number of enslaved Africans, often forced into the incredibly dangerous work in the refining mills, dealing with mercury. The Mito basically locked in a hierarchy. Indigenous laborers were at the bottom, almost powerless. They faced horrific working conditions deep underground, plus the dangers of mercury poisoning in the Patio Process for refining. Mortality rates were catastrophically high. The city was fundamentally defined by this brutal system of forced labor. Social mobility for that massive lower class, virtually impossible.
Okay, so Potosí is this model of just monumental, explosive growth, fueled entirely by state-coerced labor. Now let's head north, metaphorically speaking, to Zacatecas in New Spain, because the silver boom there, it created a really different kind of city.
Zacatecas is a really crucial comparison. Its main boom came a bit later. It really picks up steam in the early 18th century, sort of peaks in the 1730s.
And maybe not quite the global behemoth Potosí was, but still hugely important for New Spain's economy, right?
Oh, absolutely pivotal. At its height, sources suggest Zacatecas was producing something like 25% quarter of all the silver coming out of Mexico. That kept the colonial finances going, funded the administration. It was critical. But here's a key difference in scale. While Zacatecas was a major regional center, its peak population was around 40,000 residents, maybe in 1732 or so. Much smaller than Potosí. And that difference, I think, partly reflects a very different labor situation. Unlike the Andes, with its dense indigenous populations that the Spanish could tap for the Mita, the Zacatecas region, while it had a much sparser native population nearby when the Spanish arrived.
Okay, so if they couldn't just draft tens of thousands of people, like in Potosí, how did they get 40,000 people out there, basically in the middle of nowhere, to dig for silver?
They had to rely much more on a wage economy. It wasn't purely free labor. People were often indebted or coerced in other ways, but fundamentally it was about attracting workers. They needed people to choose to come, even if driven by desperation. And that fundamentally changed the demographics. Zacatecas was definitely multi-ethnic. You find Spanish, mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry, mulattoes, mixed Spanish and African, alongside indigenous groups and black populations, both free and enslaved. But the really key analytical difference, I think, is the role of indigenous people within Zacatecas itself. Here, you find a significant population of what the sources sometimes call urban Indians. Now, unlike the Potosí Matayos, who were temporary conscripts, often maintaining links to their home villages, these urban Indians in Zacatecas were largely permanent settlers. They lived there.
That feels like a really important distinction. Permanent settler versus temporary draftee. That implies a whole different connection to the place, to the colonial system.
It really does. When an indigenous person became an urban Indian in Zacatecas, they were often detached from their original community structures, their pueblos. They became residents under Spanish law, and because they were there permanently, often working for wages, they could potentially become skilled miners, artisans, maybe even foremen. Now, it wasn't easy, but it offered a small pathway for social mobility, a chance to build a family and a life within the city itself that was far, far less likely for the constantly rotating temporary Mita workers in Potosí.
So the labor system in Zacatecas relying more on attraction, on wages, rather than just this massive draft. It fostered a city where the social structure was maybe a bit more fluid. You still had miners, merchants, officials, that whole hierarchy.
Yeah.
But the way indigenous people fit in was less about coercion, maybe more integrated into the city's long-term life. Though we should be really clear, right? This wasn't some kind of workers' paradise.
No, absolutely not.
The sources are clear. Conditions for wage laborers could still be incredibly harsh, dangerous work, low pay, debt peonage was common. And the city's fortunes, its population, were still completely tied to silver production. When the veins started to give out, or the price dropped, the population could shrink just as fast as it grew.
That's the boom and bust nature of the extraction city, isn't it? It's almost inevitable. But what's crucial here, comparing the two, is that both models, Potosí's forced draft and Zacatecas' settler wage system, show silver's incredible power to drive urbanization and create diverse cities. But they did it by messing with indigenous populations in totally different ways. The Miteca basically depopulated huge areas around Potosí and built this rigidly layered city on, frankly, mass human suffering. Zacatecas, because it didn't have that same vast labor pool to draft from, had to use incentives. And maybe inadvertently, that fostered a more permanent urban workforce, including indigenous people and mestizos who had maybe a tiny bit more economic leverage, a bit more permanence in the city structure.
So when we boil it down, what's the long-term legacy here? It's not just about the silver pulled out of the ground. It's about the social structures, the hierarchies, these booms embedded, right?
Precisely. The lasting thing is that stratification. In Potosí, it was immediate, stark, fixed by the forced labor system. The city's very layout was about managing draftees. In Zacatecas, stratification was definitely, their wealth was everything. But the wage system, needing different kinds of labor, allowed for these mestizo and urban Indian groups to emerge, filling those middle-rung jobs, which maybe, potentially, created a slightly more integrated, perhaps more resilient social fabric over the very long term. I mean, the sources really force you to see these cities didn't just grow outwards like a normal city might. They grew upwards instantly, creating these complex social hierarchies right from day one. The whole structure, laws, buildings, everything was geared toward getting that silver out as efficiently as possible, using whatever labor system worked locally.
The sheer scale just remains kind of mind-boggling. Potosí especially. That idea of 1 in 7 men drafted year after year just to keep a city of 200,000 going, it's hard to truly wrap your head around that level of societal engineering.
Yeah, it is. And it leaves us with a really interesting final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. These cities were fundamentally artificial creations, right? Conjured into existence by this sudden mineral wealth. So when you look around today at modern cities that maybe have their roots in resource extraction, could be oil, could be coal, timber, whatever, how much of those initial, often chaotic, highly stratified social and demographic patterns, the ones set during the boom years, how much of that still lingers? Maybe in the city's layout, its architecture, its politics, its culture, even centuries after that original resource boom has faded?
That is a really powerful question about how we build our societies and what ghosts remain. Thank you for walking us through this incredible comparison, a real deep dive into silver's power. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, imagine this. Your country suddenly becomes the wealthiest in Europe, absolutely swimming in resources.
Sounds pretty good, right?
You'd think, but what if I told you that very wealth led directly to, a century-long economic decline?
It does sound kind of crazy.
But that's the paradox we're diving into today. We want to understand the huge impact of Spanish-American silver. You know, the shiploads coming in during the 16th, 17th century.
Yeah, how it affected Europe. But crucially, why this mountain of silver ended up being, well, almost a curse for Spain itself.
Exactly. It's often called the price revolution, this whole period.
And it's a fascinating story. Looking at the sources, you can really see how this incredible, almost unearned wealth just destabilized Spain's entire system.
A short-term boom, but long-term problems.
That's it. Glory first, then the slow decline.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Spain had this empire, sun never sets, all that, and this wasn't just a bit of extra cash.
Oh no, this was the major source of wealth globally at the time.
So where did it all actually come from, these vast riches?
You really have to picture the sheer scale. Mostly from two legendary mining areas.
Okay.
Potosí, which is in modern Bolivia now.
Right.
And Zacatecas in Mexico. Potosí especially was just mythic.
I've heard the name.
Yeah, they called it the Imperial City. It churned out so much silver that the phrase worth a Potosí became common across Europe for something incredibly valuable.
Wow. And how did the Spanish crown actually get its hands on this? Just take it all?
Not quite all, but a very significant chunk. Through the the Royal Fifth.
The Royal Fifth, okay.
A 20% tax on all the mining profits.
Yeah.
It was this constant, reliable flood of silver.
So for a good stretch there, 16th, early 17th century, Spain was loaded, the richest nation in Europe.
Absolutely, no question. They could fund things other powers couldn't even dream of.
Like what did they actually do with all that silver? I mean, beyond just filling up the treasury.
Well, they used it to be Spain, really. Three main things jump out. First, financing the Habsburgs' massive ambitions. Think endless wars, suppressing revolts like in the Netherlands, funding the Armada. That costs a fortune.
Right. Military spending. Huge drain.
Huge. Second, you see it in monumental building projects, the court's splendor, showing off the wealth. And third, it really fueled the cultural boom, the Spanish Golden Age. Amazing art, literature. Think Cervantes, Velázquez. That costs money too.
Yeah, it definitely looked good on the surface. And the sources mentioned this, right? A temporary boost in GDP per capita. They were actually ahead of rivals for maybe a century.
Yeah, for about 100 years, Spain looked like the powerhouse. It must have felt pretty invincible from the inside.
And here's the turn. This is where it gets really interesting.
Exactly, because this massive influx of silver, this hard currency, it starts to mess with the value of money itself.
Right. It triggers this massive inflation, the price revolution you mentioned.
That's it. And it's easy to think inflation is just about printing paper money, but no.
This was actual silver. How does solid silver cause runaway inflation? It seems weird.
It's classic monetary inflation, just with metal instead of paper. Think of money, even silver, like any other good.
Okay.
If you suddenly dump tons more of it into the system, but the amount of stuff to buy, food, tools, clothes, doesn't increase at the same rate.
The value of the money goes down, prices go up.
Precisely. There was just way more money chasing roughly the same amount of goods produced in Spain. So prices had to rise dramatically.
And the numbers are pretty stark. By the mid-1600s, prices in Spain were, up to 200% higher than elsewhere in Europe?
Yeah, 200% more than comparable regions. That's not just inconvenient, it's economically crippling for ordinary people. Savings wiped out, planning becomes impossible.
Yeah, yes.
Pretty much. But the inflation, believe it or not, was only part of the problem. The deeper issue, the reason Spain ultimately declined, wasn't just the money supply.
It was what they did or didn't do with it.
Exactly. It was the failure of their own domestic production to, respond.
Okay. So this gets to the poor economic management idea. But let's dig into why. Why couldn't they use this capital injection to build up their own industries?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it boils down to institutional problems, deep-seated issues in the Spanish economy.
Like what specifically?
Well, instead of investing that silver in, say, new manufacturing or better farming techniques, the elite and the crown just spent it. They bought what they needed from other countries.
So they needed textiles, tools, maybe even food sometimes.
And they just paid the English or the Dutch or the Italians in silver rather than making it themselves.
Why couldn't they make it themselves? What was stopping them?
A couple of big things stand out in the sources. First, the Mesta.
The sheep guild.
Yeah, the incredibly powerful guild of sheep owners. They had legal rights to vast areas for grazing,
Okay.
which actively blocked the expansion of farming land. So Spain often struggled to feed itself efficiently, and food prices stayed high.
Wow. So sheep politics literally held back agricultural development.
That was a big part of it. And then in the cities, you had very rigid guilds controlling manufacturing.
Like unions, but older.
Sort of, yeah. They stifled innovation, kept out competition. They couldn't really scale up or adopt new, cheaper methods like those being developed elsewhere.
So if you needed, I don't know, a bunch of shoes or ship sails.
It was often just cheaper and easier to buy them from foreigners who had modernized, even though Spain had all this silver.
It's starting to sound less like bad luck and more like shooting themselves in the foot. They had the money, but their own internal structures, the Mesta, the guild.
Prevented that money from being used productively at home.
Exactly.
Spain ended up needing foreign goods way more than foreigners needed Spanish goods, apart from maybe wool and silver itself.
So they paid for everything with silver, a huge trade
A
deficit.
massive one. They were basically exporting their capital to fund consumption. And in doing so, they were effectively paying for the industrial development of their rivals.
Okay, so that silver pouring out of Spain, what did that do to the rest of Europe? The inflation must have spread.
Oh, absolutely. It didn't just stop at the border. As Spain paid its soldiers in Flanders, its bankers in Genoa, its suppliers in Amsterdam,
The silver flowed out.
right into the economies of France, the Netherlands, England, everywhere. And yes, it fueled trade, finance, but it also pushed up prices across the continent. That's why it's a price revolution, not just a Spanish problem.
But crucially, it affected those other countries differently, didn't it? They got the inflation too, but they seemed to handle the silver better.
That's the key difference. It's the stark contrast. For Spain, the silver mostly paid for wars, consumption, servicing debt. Short-term stuff.
Okay.
For places like the Netherlands and England, this influx of Spanish silver was, well, capital. They got it by selling goods to Spain.
Right. They earned it through production.
And then they reinvested it into building better ships, more efficient textile production, expanding their own trade networks. They used the silver to build productive capacity.
So Spain's silver effectively funded its rivals' economic takeoff.
In a very real way, yes. Spain got that century of looking rich because of the sheer volume of silver. But the long-term result was stagnation. Once the silver flow started to slow down, maybe in the later 17th century.
Or when their own goods became ridiculously expensive due to that 200% inflation.
Exactly. Nobody outside Spain could afford Spanish products anymore. They were left with an economy that hadn't modernized, hadn't industrialized. It was stuck.
The silver was like a drug then. It felt good, hid the underlying problems.
That's a great way to put it. It masked the urgent need for reforms. Why bother tackling the Mestas or shaking up the guilds or investing in new industries when silver just kept rolling in?
It let them ignore the fundamental weaknesses.
Until it was far, far too late. The very resource that brought them that golden age ultimately made them vulnerable.
Which brings us neatly back to the core idea of this deep dive. Spanish silver, incredible wealth.
Yeah. Temporarily made them super rich.
But the sheer scale triggered the price revolution, massive inflation. And because Spain's own system couldn't channel that wealth into productive investment.
Because of those institutional roadblocks we talked about.
Right. It led to long-term stagnation while its competitors used that same silver to leap ahead.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About resource wealth in general.
How so?
Well, you see similar patterns today, perhaps. Countries heavily reliant on one single commodity, maybe oil or gas or certain minerals.
The resource curse idea.
Exactly. Is that sudden massive wealth automatically a good thing? Does it actually help build a diverse, resilient economy? Or does it sometimes, like with Spain, just prop up the status quo?
Make it easier to avoid the hard work of building other sectors.
Right. Does it maybe encourage just living off the resource income, meaning short-term gain potentially comes at the cost of long-term stability and strength?
A really powerful historical lesson with echoes even now. Amazing stuff. Thanks for walking us through the complex economics of the price revolution.
Absolutely. It's a story that never gets old.